Hello, hello, hello. This is Dr. Bev Knox, your psychology exam study buddy, here to go over with you today the basic concepts of sensation and perception. As you guys know, I do one episode fully on theory and trying to assist you in knowing more about definitions and concepts. And the following episode is strictly exam questions and answers found from an actual psychology exam test bank. So really cool stuff going on. I appreciate the fact that you've taken this time to participate in this study buddy episode, okay? All right, and don't forget you are to listen to these episodes over and over because I want this information to sink into your long-term memory. And also I want you to ace your psychology exam. So let's get started. Let's get started with some basic definitions first, okay? Now, sensation is the process by which our sensory receptors and nervous system receive and represent stimulus energies from our environment. So, sensation is the process by which our sensory receptors and nervous system receive and represent stimulus energies from our environment. As you know, I tend to repeat myself over and over and over because I want this information again to seep into your long-term memory. So, sensation is the process by which our what? Sensory receptors and what? Our nervous system receive and represent stimulus energies from where? From our environment. Okay, so let's just tell a little story here. Heather Sellers' curious mix of perfect vision and face blindness illustrates the distinction between sensation and perception. When she looks at a friend, her sensation is normal. Her sensory receptors detect the same information yours would, and her nervous system transmits that information to her brain. Her perception, the processes by which her brain organizes and interprets sensory input, is almost normal. Thus, she may recognize people from their hair, voice, or particular physique, not just from their face. Her experience is much like the struggle any human would have trying to recognize a specific penguin. Now this little story depicts what sensation is, also talks about sensory receptors and perception. So we know that sensation is what? The process by which our sensory receptors and nervous system receive and represent stimulus energies from our environment. Now, sensory receptors are sensory nerve endings that respond to stimuli. Sensory receptors are sensory nerve endings that respond to stimuli. And perception is the process of organizing and interpreting sensory information enabling us to recognize meaningful objects and events. Now, I have a little trick here. In my classroom, I always talk about sensation and perception. I tell my students to remember this. Sensation is the information being received in via our senses. And we know what our 5 senses are, which I'll go over in a minute in detail. But sensation is the information being received in, whether it's through hearing, touching, smelling, tasting, seeing. That information being received in via our senses. And perception is the interpretation of that information. So with perception, you have the process of organizing and interpreting that information that's being received in via our senses. Okay? All right, let's move on. We're not going to talk about top-down processing and bottom-up processing. You need to know the meaning of these two. So bottom-up processing basically is the analysis that begins with the sensory receptors. And what are sensory receptors? Sensory nerve endings that respond to stimuli. So bottom-up processing is the analysis that begins with the sensory receptors and works up to the brain's integration of sensory information. Bottom-up processing starts at your sensory receptors and works up to higher levels of processing. Sensory information is being analyzed. Okay, so with bottom-up processing is the analysis that begins when? With the what? Sensory receptors, and works up to the brain's integration of sensory information. So bottom-up processing starts at your sensory receptors and works up to higher levels of processing. Now, top-down processing is when information processing guided by higher level mental processes, as when we construct perceptions drawing on our experience and expectations. So that one's a little bit different, right? Top-down processing is information processing guided by higher level mental processes, as when we construct perceptions drawing on our experience and expectations. So top-down processes constructs perceptions from this sensory input by drawing on your experience and expectations. As your brain absorbs the information, bottom-up processing enables your sensory system to detect the lines, angles, and colors that form the flower and leaves. Using top-down processing, you interpret what your senses detect. All right, let's move on to transduction. Transduction is basically the conversion of one form of energy into another. In sensation, the transforming of stimulus energies such as sights, sound, and smells into neural impulses our brain can interpret. Transduction. Transduction is the conversion of one form of energy into another. In sensation, the transforming of stimulus energies, such as sight, sounds, and smells, into neural impulses in our brain, and our brain can interpret it. So, there are 3 basic steps to our sensory system, okay? Every second of every day, our sensory systems perform an amazing feat. They convert one form of energy into another. Vision processes light energy. Hearing processes sound waves. All our senses receive sensory stimulation, often using specialized receptor cells. All our senses transform that stimulation into neural impulses. All our senses deliver the neural information to our brain. So again, the process of converting one form of energy into another form that our brain can use is called transduction. How we see, hear, feel pain, taste, smell, keep our balance. In each case, one of our sensory systems receives, transforms, and delivers the information to our brain. That's really interesting stuff, isn't it? Okay. Now, let's move on. Next, let's talk about psychophysics for a minute. Psychophysics is the study of relationships between the physical characteristics of stimuli, such as their intensity, and our psychological experience of them. So, the field of psychophysics studies the relationship between what? The physical energy we can detect and its effects on our psychological experience. Psychophysics is the study of relationships between the physical characteristics of stimuli, such as their intensity and our psychological experience of them. Let's explore some strengths and weaknesses in our ability to detect and interpret stimuli in the vast sea of energy around us. So, at this moment, we are being struck by X-rays and radio waves, ultraviolet and infrared light, and sound waves of very high and very low frequencies. To all of these, we are blind and deaf. Other animals with different needs detect a world that lies beyond our experience. Migrating birds stay on course aided by an internal magnetic compass. Bats and dolphins locate prey By using sonar, bouncing, echoing sounds off objects, bees navigate on cloudy days by detecting invisible, to us, not to them, but by detecting invisible polarized light. Our senses open the shades just a crack, allowing us a restricted awareness of this vast sea of energy. But for our needs, this may be enough. Let's talk about the absolute threshold. The absolute threshold is the minimum stimulus energy needed to detect a particular stimulus 50% of the time. Absolute threshold is the minimum stimulus energy needed to detect a particular stimulus 50% of the time. So, to some kinds of stimuli, we are exquisitely sensitive. Standing atop a mountain on an utterly dark, perfectly clear night, most of us could see a candle flame atop another mountain 30 miles away. We could feel the wind of a bee falling on our cheek. We could smell a single drop of perfume in a 3-room apartment. But with absolute thresholds, it is the minimum stimulus energy needed to detect a particular stimulus 50% of the time. Now, detecting a weak stimulus or signal depends not only on its strength, but also on our psychological state, our experience, expectations, motivation, and alertness. The signal detection theory predicts when we will detect weak signals. Now, this is a definition you need to know, okay? Signal detection theory. It is a theory predicting how and when we detect the presence of a faint stimulus, which is the signal, amid background stimulation, which is the noise. It assumes there is no single absolute threshold, and that detection depends partly on a person's experience, expectations, motivations, and alertness. Signal detection theory. It is a theory predicting how and when we detect the presence of a faint stimulus amid background stimulation, which is the noise. Assumes there is no single absolute threshold, and that detection depends partly on a person's experience, expectations, motivation, and alertness. Now, let's move on to subliminal. And we've heard this term before, but let's get the precise definition. Subliminal is below one's absolute threshold for conscious awareness. Now, we talked about what conscious versus unconscious means in prior episodes. So conscious awareness, the word conscious, all it means is that we are aware of what's going on. Okay? We are aware. And unconscious, we're not aware. So with subliminal, it means below one's absolute threshold for conscious awareness. All right. So stimuli you cannot consciously detect 50% of the time are subliminal, which is below your absolute threshold. One experiment using subliminal stimuli illustrated the deep reality of sexual orientation. As people gazed at the center of a screen, a photo of a nude person was flashed on one side of a scrambled version of the photo on the other side. Now, because the nude images were immediately masked by a colored checkerboard, viewers consciously perceived nothing but flashes of color, and so were unable to state on which side the nude had appeared. So again, this is called subliminal, okay, which means below one's absolute threshold of conscious awareness. Let's move on to priming. Priming is the activation, often unconsciously, of certain associations, thus predisposing one's perception, memory, or response. Priming is the activation, often unconsciously, of certain associations, thus predisposing one's perception, memory, or response. Okay, let's move on to difference threshold. It is the minimum difference between two stimuli required for detection 50% of the time. We experience the difference threshold as just a noticeable difference. Okay? So the difference threshold, or the just noticeable difference, is the minimum difference a person can detect between any two stimuli half the time. That detectable difference increases with the size of the stimulus. If we listen to our music at 40 decibels, we might detect an added 5 decibels. But if we increase the volume to 110, we probably won't then detect an additional 5 decimal change. Okay? Let's move on to Weber's law. Weber's law is the principle that to be perceived as different, two stimuli must differ by a constant minimum percentage rather than a constant amount. Again, Weber's law is the principle that to be perceived as different, two stimuli must differ by a constant minimum percentage rather than a constant amount. So, in the late 1800s, Ernest Weber described this with a principle so simple and so widely acceptable that we still refer it as Weber's law. For an average person to perceive a difference, two stimuli must differ by a constant minimum percentage, not a constant amount. The exact percentage varies depending on the stimulus. Two lights, for example, must differ in intensity by 8%. Two objects must differ in weight by 2%, and two tones must differ in frequency by only 0.3%. All right, so let's move on to sensory adaptation. And this is always on my exams, so definitely know this one, okay? Sensory adaptation is the diminished sensitivity as a consequence of constant stimulation. Sensory adaptation is diminished sensitivity as a consequence of constant stimulation. So, sitting down on a bus, you are overwhelmed by your seatmate's heavy perfume. You wonder how she endures it. But within minutes, you no longer notice it. Sensory adaptation has come to your rescue. When constantly exposed to an unchanging stimulus, we become less aware of it because our nerve cells fire less frequency. So, to experience sensory adaptation, roll up your sleeve. You will feel it, but only for a few moments. Why? Then, if we stare at an object without flinching, does it not vanish from sight? Okay. Because unnoticed by us, our eyes are always moving. This continual flitting from one spot to another ensures that stimulation of the eye receptors continually changes. Which brings us to our next definition, perceptual set. Perceptual set is a mental predisposition to perceive one thing and not another. Perceptual set is a mental predisposition to perceive one thing and not another. To see is to believe. As we less fully appreciate, to believe is to see. Through experience, we come to expect certain results. Those expectations may give us a perceptual set, a set of mental tendencies and assumptions that affects top down what we hear, taste, feel, and see. Perceptual set influences how we interpret stimuli, but our immediate context and the motivation and emotion we bring to a situation also affect our interpretations. Motivation gives us energy as we work towards a goal, for example. Like context, they can bias our interpretations of neutral stimuli. Consider these findings. Desirable objects such as a water bottle viewed by a thirsty person seem closer than they actually are. This perceptual bias energizes our going for it. What about emotion? Emotion basically says other clever experiments have demonstrated that emotions can shove our perceptions in one direction or another. Really? Emotion does all that? Yes, it does. Hearing sad music can predispose people to perceive a sad meaning in spoken words. Mourning rather than mourning. Mourning, mourning, like mourning the loss of a loved one, rather than mourning, morning, like good morning. So hearing sad music can predispose people to perceive a sad meaning in spoken words. Now, when angry, people often perceive neutral objects as dangerous objects. Emotions and motives color our social perceptions too. People more often perceived solidarity confinement, sleep deprivation, and cold temperatures as torture when experiencing a small dose of such themselves. Spouses who feel loved and appreciated perceive less threat in stressful marital events. This is very interesting stuff. Again, this is all about the basic concepts of sensation and perception. Okay, now I want to go over a little bit in regards to sensory interaction, okay? So all our senses, and we know what those are, and you really need to know it because you'll see it on any psychology exam when talking about sensation and perception, which are seeing, these are all our senses, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching. Eavesdrop on one another, and our brain blends their input to interpret the world. This is sensory interaction at work. One sense can influence another. Sensory interaction. The principle that one sense may influence another, as when the smell of food influences its taste. Now, embodied cognition is the influence of bodily sensations, gestures, and other states of cognitive preferences and judgments. Embodied cognition is the influence of bodily sensations, gestures, and other states of cognitive preferences and judgments. So, we have seen that our perceptions have two main ingredients: our bottom-up sensations and our top-down cognitions, such as expectations, attitudes, thoughts, and memories. In everyday life, sensations and perception are 2 points of a continuum. It is not surprising then that the brain circuits processing our physical sensations sometimes interact with brain circuits responsible for cognition. The result is embodied cognition. We think from our what? We think from what? Within a body. Now, some examples from playful experiments. Ready? Physical warmth may promote social warmth. After holding a warm drink rather than a cold one, people were more likely to rate someone more warmly and feel closer to them. As we attempt to decipher our world, our brain blends inputs from multiple channels. But in a few select individuals, the brain circuits for two or more senses become joined, where the stimulation of one sense, such as hearing sound, triggers an experience of another, such as seeing color. Okay, let's move on to some really exciting things. ESP, perception without sensation. So, the river of perception is fed by sensation, cognition, and emotions. If perception is the product of these three sources, what can we say about extrasensory perception, also known as ESP, which claims that perception can occur apart from sensory input? Are there indeed people, any people, who can read minds, see thought walls, or foretell the future? Nearly half of Americans have agreed there are indeed something called ESP. So again, extrasensory perception, also known as ESP, is the controversial claim that perception can occur apart from sensory input, which includes clairvoyance and precognition and telepathy. Now, we need to know the definition of parapsychology, okay? It is the study of phenomena, including ESP and other psychokinesis. So, parapsychology, okay, it's a branch of psychology focusing on the paranormal, paranormal phenomena, including ESP and psychokinesis. Now, if ESP is real, we would need to overturn the scientific understanding that we are creatures whose minds are tied to our physical brains and whose perceptual experiences of the world are built of sensations. Telepathy is mind-to-mind communication. Also, clairvoyance. Clairvoyance is perceiving remote events, such as a house on fire in another state. Again, clairvoyance is perceiving remote events, such as a house on fire in another state. Precognition is perceiving future events, such as an unexpected death in the next month. Closely linked is psychokinesis, or mind-moving matter, such as levitating a table or influencing the roll of a die. The claim is illustrated by the WRY request. Will all those who believe in psychokinesis please raise my hand? Most research psychologists and scientists have been skeptical that paranormal phenomena exist. But in several reputable universities, parapsychology researchers perform scientific experiments researching for possible ESP phenomena. Now, let us review the definition again. So, extrasensory perception is called what? ESP. And it is a very controversial claim that perception can occur apart from what? Perception can occur apart from sensory input. And it includes what? What are the three major types? That's right. Telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. And telepathy is what? You are correct again. Mind-to-mind communication. And clairvoyance is what? Perceiving remote events, such as a house on fire in another state. And what is precognition? Perceiving future events. What about psychokinesis? What is it? Mind-moving matter. And a great example is what? Levitating a table or influencing the role. Very good. You are doing great. Now, what is parapsychology? Parapsychology is the study of paranormal phenomena, including ESP and psychokinesis. And in some reputable universities, which is great, parapsychology researchers perform scientific experiments researching for possible ESP phenomena. Okay, well, this ends this episode of the Psychology Exam Study Buddy, all about what? All about sensation and perception. And see how we talked a little bit about parapsychology and ESP. So as you know, this episode talks fully about the theory and concepts. And in our next episode, I'm going to give you actual questions and answers from an actual psychology exam. All right? Focusing strictly on the concept of sensation and perception. All right, guys, I will see you in our next episode.